I encountered Dr. Amaki's works. Those of you who were at the gallery last night heard the story, but my husband and I were flying in from, I don't know where, California or something. And we were in the terminal in Atlanta, and we walked in, and I was totally mesmerized by the beautiful, dramatic, expressive artwork that was in the terminal. The entire terminal was filled with these giant boxes of photo encrusted with buttons and wonderful cyanotypes, which are blue and white prints. If you haven't taken photography, it's kind of like a blueprint, a repetitive pattern like a large paper quilt on the wall. And I was snapping pictures all over with my cell phone, and when we got home, I seriously researched Dr. Amaki and found out how I could contact her, and we established a little rapport by email, and as you can see the result, we have her here in person, which is a great honor for us. So you have a little information about Dr. Amaki on your card. You can also Google her. She's clearly available on Wikipedia, but I'll read the card to you just for those of you that haven't taken time. Dr. Amalia Amaki is an internationally renowned artist, poet. You know that because you saw the poetry in the gallery. Art historian, educator, film critic, and curator. Many of her artworks capture the lives of African women of the diaspora through media from everyday life. Photography, quilts, buttons, boxes, and household items. She has had 47 solo exhibitions and participated in more than 100 group shows in 39 states, as well as in Italy, France, England, Ghana, China, Mexico, Argentina, and Brazil. Her photography, photo-based, and new media-based artwork combines fabricated and found components to address implications of popular media, cultural assumption, and commercialism. And so I give you Dr. Amalia Amaki.
Thank you. And for those of you who weren't here last night, I do want to reiterate that what is presented there is an artist book project. And this is the first venue to see what I call the coming together of the images and the poems in a tactile format. So this is the first time the actual works are seen, because when the book comes out, those are images. So you won't have the same sense of that relationship between objects and sound, or objects and words. It's also important to me to underscore that this project came about as a result of my efforts to a certain extent, save my life. I needed something to get me off the floor. And I was on the floor because of 4 devastating losses in a period of 6 months. It started with the death of Michael Jackson. It took me weeks to even sleep after that horrific news. But within 7 days of his death, someone who had been my brother for almost 30 years suddenly died. And then 3 weeks after that, Frank McCourt died. Frank McCourt had been like a father figure for me at that point, for about 11 years. And then a few months after that, someone who was very important in the field of African American art. He was a very important collector who lived in the metropolitan Atlanta area, who I had a relationship with as a curator, as a writer of the art that was in his collection. I helped him carry his dreams about how art could create bridges between people who thought they were inseparable and people who thought that they could never be united. I shared that peculiar destiny with Mr. Jones. So those deaths occurred over a span of 6 months. And the way that I thought about it is all the legs of the table that held me up had been knocked from under me. I had to struggle to find a way to get off that floor. And one of the ways that I realized was important for doing that would be to create something. And to create something that not only spoke about how I felt, but that spoke about how those people affected my life. Once that process started, I ended up writing poems or discovering poems that had already been written about 16 people who really had played pivotal roles in making me stand up, get up, and do something about the pain that I was going through. So I will begin by reading for you a part of the introduction to that artist's book. And there is a very advanced mock-up of what that final product will be in the gallery. And you are welcome to handle it, to flip through the pages. This is one of those rare opportunities where you can touch the things that are on view. So you really should take advantage of it. I have to put these on. Because if it was back there, I could read it, but since it's right here, I better put these on. My life has not been easy. Personal loss has rolled over me like a freight train. Betrayal has cut me to pieces with the violence of a machete. I have been severely beaten psychologically, almost beyond recognition, by abandonment, isolation, jealousy, and disappointment. I have experienced hunger, loneliness, violence, and the full measure of hatred. I have known the sting of having a deeply held dream shattered, the sledgehammer blow of fatal medical reports, the helplessness and devastation of criminal victimization, and the horror of passing through seasons without feeling loved. But I have never been left to choke, thirst, starve, or bleed to death. At every turn, during the most potentially damaging low point, someone, a real friend, either miraculously discovered me or missed me long enough to seek and find me, tend my wounds, provide nourishment, and take my hand in ways that facilitated my walk back to a safe place. These compassionate, loving human beings inevitably crafted ways to impart seeds of stability into the rockiest areas of my world. In their own unique ways, they were incredible givers, teachers, and examples of the highest caliber of human potential. They showed up, they acted, and they cared. This collection of poems and images is a modest gesture of thanks to the members of this group who have made the transition. They're no longer with us. And I celebrate their roles in saving my life, collectively and individually, in a body of work that's called Homage. What I essentially did in pulling the work together is I looked to the poets in my life. I looked to the people I call the faith givers. I looked to the maker of things, people who were in my life root doctors, lemonade providers, cool, calm-headed warriors, I looked up, I looked back, I looked out, I looked around, and I looked toward those who understood the ancient ways and who knew something about what I call the ancient days. I began to see connections between these verses of my life. And the images I made were not only reflections of how I felt about them, they were my own language, a language created through the metaphors of their generosity. This image is entitled Ballerina, and it's one image that's dedicated to a young lady, Anya. Anya was 24 years old when she took her life. It's sad that she would take her life in a period of time when she was saving mine. The poem to Anya is called Another Day. Another day, one more day with unnatural rituals, harsh routines, hazardous routes, and a once-in-a-lifetime setting. Settings caking around bedside copies of Vanity Fair and Vogue. No more contracts, no offers, no messages, no letters, no invites, no notes, only bills and dreams frustratingly pressed between hope and the ice-cold reality that while still reasonably young and with pretty holding things together for one more day, the sound of ticking reminds how gradually, continually, inevitably, it all slips away. The taking of her life was described by her twin sister as a horrible symphony. A symphony that played to deaf ears and a tune that only made sense to the evil, the dark, and the lost. What saved Anya's sister, was that poem. And every day I receive a very short communication from Anna because she still thanks me for saving her life, because twins have an inexplainable need and desire to be together. That's extremely important to me because I come from a place where, in many cases, artwork is seen, if not as something decorative, its function is often seen as commercial and even as entertainment. It's why the art reviews are often in the entertainment section of the newspaper. Some of the work very much opens up what I call the private corners of my life. I had the pleasure of, I was a Jim Morrison Doors groupie. Of course, I was young, I was like 5, but I was very much a Doors groupie. And even though I thought Jim Morrison was beautiful, what drew me to him was that part of him that was a poet. I very much tapped in at an early entry into a knowledge of the Doors and Jim Morrison, that this was someone who was more than a musician, and that his genius could only result in him being perceived by too many, too often, as someone who was bordering on being mad. It's a shame that we don't have the ability to perceive when we are in the presence of genius. Jean-Michel Basquiat, another example of someone, I love Basquiat because he was someone who innately understood the inseparability of creating images, making sounds, and being. Basquiat was a jazz musician in addition to being a great painter, and he was a painter that I refer to as a painter who didn't paint. While he did use paint, he was clearly, in my opinion, a poet, creating poetry on his canvases. His language was so tight and so personal and so shrewd and so cerebral that most people still don't get it. But I also like, I have to confess, I was dating someone who was in the band, the group that he was in at the time, and that facilitated our meeting. But I knew even then that he was someone who needed to be enjoyed because you could smell the fact that he would not live to grow old. Frank McCourt was my daddy. What more can I say? And I wanted to also read a poem about Vinnie. Vinnie was someone who saw me in an art museum when I was 15 years old. He was 23, and he knew at that moment that he was looking at his wife. When he showed up at my door, at my family's home, after gaining permission to come there, my father and mother incorrectly assumed he was coming to see my oldest sister, who was 20 at the time. And immediately upon realizing that this was not the case, my father retrieved a metal blue bat that was behind the front door and threatened him in ways that a side of my father came out that I had never seen. And he said, "Do you understand? My daughter is 15 years old." And Vinnie's response was, "I will leave. But she's 15 years here. Her soul, like mine, is eternally old." My father didn't care about philosophy. So Vinnie had to go. But he's someone who, in today's vernacular, we would call what he did stalking. Because he watched me continually until I turned 18. He had photographs of all of the high points in my life from the time that I was 15 until I graduated from high school. My senior year, my father died. So he appealed to my mother, hoping she was a cooler, calmer, more sensitive being. My mother said, I want her to finish college first. Promise me you will stay away until she graduates from undergraduate school. And she said that because she knew I was high strung, independent, and sneaky. And she knew that I could keep a secret, that I could hide things from her for 4 years. But she appealed to what she discerned to be the gentleman that was in him. And she won out. Even though I made attempts to see him, he wouldn't do it. He honored the promise he made to my mother. Vinny transitioned 5 years later. And I wrote this poem. It's called Compatibility. Where am I? What am I? Who am I without you floating balloons of laughter into the hurting places? Without you counting the steps of each traumatic walk out loud until you manage to talk your way into my journey. Without you transforming my aria into a duet and luring my anger to safe havens of forgiveness and no regret. Who am, what am, and how am I supposed to rise in the light of loving eyes and know the comfort of clarified embrace where duty, obligation, expectation are replaced with raw, pure, no matter what love? You placed me on a plateau far, far above carnality. You hear, see, understand me in life's corridors, cacophony and ugly ways. You press tiny rainbows into difficult days, accusing nothing, asking nothing in return. How am, who am, what am I without you mirroring the shying parts we cover together? Without you trusting me to scrutinize your complex heart, to witness the full measure of your flaws, your dreams, your sins. You did not hesitate to let me in. Without the sheer anticipation of you, simply you, what am I to do? Who am, what am, where am I to house the unfinished symphonies, the sound of one hand clapping, the ticking clock with no face, the serendipities. Without your voice as the conduit of delicate calm, without your unplanned brush against my arm or shoulder or back or knee, without your battles, defeats, victories, obscurities, where would I be? You, me, we epitomize compatibility. And then there was Graham. Graham was my brother, even though he was a Guala Sioux. Even though he hungered, he said, for the dirt that America called South Dakota. He was my brother. And in a manner similar to my experiences with Vinny, when Graham and I met in a library, and he walked up to me while I was doing graduate research as a grad student at Emory University. He walked up to me and said, "You're Indian." And I said, "Well, my mother is half Choctaw and my father is half Cherokee." He says, "You're Indian." And we made a kind of strange bond in the shelves of that library, that he would become my teacher so that I would understand the full implication of what it meant to be Indian. Graham is the person who died exactly 7 days after Michael Jackson. And I wrote this poem for Graham called Shape Shifter. You hit the ground in silence, landing squarely on both feet. Your outstretched arms, like wings, were poised, mighty, beautiful. You clasped the endlessness of former and latter days between pearly white teeth that glowed brighter than the fullness of the moon and competed with the stars for the stunning lead in the upper darkness. You manned the strict territorial boundaries with integrity and simultaneously ran freely beyond the markers and warning signs. You nourished, nurtured, healed with hidden berries and secret herbs. You cast knowing eyes toward painted sands, river flows, trails of ancestors, badger jawbones, eagle feathers, and the turtle shell rattle. And the renegade grains of sand that took flight in swift, dry winds clung to your antlers and ears. You effortlessly escaped confining garments that carried the scents of your varied species, folding them with neatness and honor. Your flute serenades became inseparable from the distant howls of wolves. Your hums matched the downbeat of eagle chirps. Your prayers struck chords with the heartbeat of owls. And your perspiration and specks of blood, evidence of your labor and marking your land, ran hot, slow, evenly and sweetly down to irrigate the vegetable patch outside your door. You were and are evermore. The greatest challenge for me in dealing with, in terms of images, I think, and poetically, in dealing with Michael was just what materials to use. That became a challenge because I wanted to use objects and images that corresponded with that contradiction between the public life and the private reality of Michael. And I decided I would go back and recoup photographs that I had taken of him over the years. I had created about 20, 30,000 images of Michael over his career. They were all his property because they were taken for him. But I decided to sift through those images and find those that, at least for me, carried the weight and the matter of that contradiction, because Michael was clearly the smartest person I knew. Extremely insightful, could solve a problem in seconds, and could see the relationship between seemingly diverse things in a blink. So one of these several poems that I wrote in conjunction with a piece called MJ Eyes is a poem for Michael called Who Has Eyes to See? Who has eyes to see? The wounded know the tragedy gunning for them, know the insomniac state of laying in wait of a reprieve from someone who recognizes them as human. Flesh and blood with needs more powerful and plentiful than the hatred and jealousy spilling over into their jubilee. Who else has eyes to see the busted heart spots a trap light years away? Knows the innocent clay punched and purged in fiery pits and harsh scenarios? Whiffs the scent of their own salty tears that careen and sting inside, unseen by cold-natured perpetrators of hindsight, false starts, untruths, obscured views, and coy entities. Who else has eyes to see the walking open injuries now, hungry and thirsty, that have come to terms with birth and duty, uncompromised by unfairness, know full well that life is truly pressed between purpose and will and love and inclinations to instill softness into the hardest conceivable stones. Hurting geniuses hone in on the need to be observers who have eyes to see. The section that addressed Michael was also difficult because I respect the true Michael that he kept hidden from the world. Everybody thinks they know him. You know what he gave you. You know what he allowed you to see. There is a life that is different from that. And by the time he was an adult, he knew how to keep that for himself. So what you know, what the world knows, is a part of the story. But it's the part that he let out. And for those who know more, there still seems to be a commitment to keep that his. It's not buried with him. It has its own eternity. But it's only available, as the poem said, it's only available for those who have eyes to see. I am a woman of secrets. If you tell me one, it goes to the grave with me. There was someone very important in my life who always asked to be known simply as the Wonder Man. I will read 2 poems, rather short poems, about the Wonder Man, poems that are dedicated to the Wonder Man. And as with the case with Michael, one of the best ways for me to deal with that loss, this was the only person I can say whose whose transition was very challenging for me, who was someone where I had the opportunity to watch the transfer of that light from this side to the other side of the veil. It was a very long, I won't say dragged out, but a very long, challenging death process. And somehow in that process, it's bewildering to me. But it's as if the closer he came to transitioning, the stronger he became. And I'm talking about an inner strength, not a physical strength. He could barely move at the moment of transition. But the power of his mind and his voice was incredible and nothing short of miraculous. The section that's dedicated to the Wonder Man opens with a poem called Ache and ends with a poem called You Kept Me.
I love that.
Ache. I've cried oceans and floated atop the salty waters like bait. I've fallen to the depths of the earth and pleaded louder than the rumble of its bowels. I've fasted in silence and isolation and searched faraway places for suitable sackcloth and ashes. I've walked through memories at a snail's pace and prayed for the power to transfigure past into present. I've laid awake for days in the hollow, murky chamber of anger and blame and denial and guilt. I've hit the ceiling with every iota of it. I've bled rivers and hidden stained organs behind desert-dry bones. I've self-examined the huge hole in the center of my being and found no compatible donor. I've applied rhythms to the realization of incredible loss and worn sorrow as my signature fashion statement. I've shadowboxed the very idea of moonlight and cursed the darkness marking its rise. I've breathed in the perfection of want and flat-out desire, then exhaled pain and lack. I've always, will always, want you back. You kept me. You kept me. Now I will keep you. Cling to the childlike wonder and soul-deep laughter. Take dominion over the sharp ears and corrected manner that left no scars. Resurrect the ability to unexpectedly amuse and diffuse pain in the same breath. I will lose myself and keep your name out of it. And yet, never ever forget who you are, every tiny bit of it. I will keep you in a close and tight fit, in the closed chambers of my being, hidden from speculative views. I will honor you with daily ritual and due seasons of reflection. My heart needs the closeness since the light dimmed. So I pledge again, my lucrative and most trusted friend, that I will keep you as you kept me until the end, the very end that knows no boundaries. Buttons, boxes, beads, photographs, postcards, these all became metaphors of who they were and are, these 16 beautiful people, these 16 beautiful beings, of how they were and are, and how much they contributed to my survival. Some of the works are what we might call old. We have a tendency to call anything 5 years, more than 5 years, old. Some of them are old, some are new, but the old was necessary to properly signify the depth of some of these relationships. And the new objects were important for bringing a fresh sense of, a sense of the fresh revelations that I now hold, because I can now look back over these memories. I can now even look at these poems. I can read these poems, and while they still become emotional points for me, I can now do it with new eyes. And I understand in fuller ways now why it is important to see. And I will end by posing the question that I often open my lectures with when I teach visual studies and art history. Do you see what you see? Or do you see what you want to see? Or do you see what you're taught to see? Or do you see what you think you're expected to see? Or do you see what you think society compels you to see? Or do you see what you need to see? When you look, do you see? Thank you, and I will entertain any questions you might have about the work, the poems, or the purpose for this project. Thank you.
I'm just curious about the one again.
You know, I can't tell you, I promised. I have to say that because, we're an interesting society of people because, and nothing taught me this more than Michael's transition. Because if you make a promise, the promise doesn't die when the person does that you promised to. I am someone, I can keep a secret. Trust me, if you need to lay your burden on somebody and not have the daily fear that in a weak moment or whatever, one of the advantages to those of you who are young, one of the advantages to growing older is you learn what your strengths, your real strengths and weaknesses are. And I can honestly say that one of my great strengths is my friends. It's going to the grave with me. I can keep a secret. And if I promise, it doesn't die if something happens to you. So, you must respect that I promised.
How long have you been writing poetry and connecting it with your work, or when did you recognize yourself as an artist? That's a good one.
As an artist? You mean as a visual artist?
As an artist,
as a
poet, all of it to me.
Well, see, I have to confess, my insistence on creating things goes back to at least 4 or 5 years old. My parents were very supportive at a time when the community where I lived was not necessarily supportive. But my mom, I remember when I was about 6, 7 years old, and my mom convinced my dad that they needed to buy me some drawing paper because that was the only way. Well, she put it this way, it's less expensive than painting every few months because I would literally draw on the walls. And she didn't want to throw cold water on that. But at the same time, she said, look, we just got to make it in the budget because it is cheaper than painting. And it got to the point where she was cleaning the drawings off the wall so much, it was taking the paint off the walls. So that was very early on. I don't know, I really can't tell you the specifics of what that early influence was. But I do know as a young child, I wanted to draw, and I always loved fashion magazines. So I started out trying to draw those models in those fashion magazines. Yes.
I noticed in the poetry that you read today that you used a lot of questions in the poems, and so it struck me as interesting that you closed with questions today. What does that act of questioning mean to you?
Well, good question. It is, very good question. And to be honest, the poems for me are conversations. I say in a lot of the poetry what I did not say when the people were on this side. And I took for granted, I confess, Michael and Graham in particular, I thought they would live forever. And the idea that, part of it started when, to be honest, one evening I was awakened and I heard a voice say, "How dare you assume anything about life?" So the conversation started, and I think the questions come because I'm still seeking answers. It's still a little bizarre to me that those, 4 a.m. conversations cannot happen with Mike and with Graham in particular, those two in particular. It's still, I have actually dialed the number and said, "Girl, they gone." Because when there's a point of desperate need, you sort of resort to that pattern of behavior that has been that point of rescue for you all of your life. And some of us, either by the decisions that we make or just the destiny walk that we are ordained to walk, we have a lot of shark-infested waters to swim through. And it's nice to know that someone's standing on the side of that water with a gun or a spear to protect you. And when those that we perceive to play those roles in our lives are taken away, I didn't immediately look for another. I looked for an explanation for why they weren't there any longer. And so I think that's a big part of that questioning. And I'm also kind of asking them if they hear me. Yes, ma'am.
When did you write the poetry? Was it something that did you have the collection and then you started to look through it and became inspired by what you saw in your lens? Or did you say to yourself, okay, I think of this poetry as I think of this person, and now I've got this picture over here, and this does demonstrate what my poetry is saying. So which is created first?
Some of the poems are old. I've always dabbled in poetry. My mother was a poet, and she didn't publish, but she was always reciting it around the house. So, and it's really funny because I guess I was a little obnoxious as a young girl, because sometimes I would make up poems and talk back to her. And of 6 girls, I was the challenge, I think. But as my dad said, that's just a mark of the fact that she's creative. But the poems, some of them are, some go back to the 80s. It's kind of funny how it started, because when I thought about doing this initially, it was something I was doing just for me. I never thought about putting it together in some kind of like an artist book format until a little later. But when these 4 legs were knocked from under me, I ran home. And by running home, I mean I went back to the things that I had written about my mother. And the moment I did that, because I'd written poems for my mother over a period of decades, and I suddenly realized I'd never written a poem to my father. And it's actually that poem to my father that sort of got the juices flowing. And I realized, okay, you can, and I have to say this, my mother transitioned in 1992. On her birthday, every year since then, I write her a poem. And it just really struck me in 2010 that my father had transitioned when I was 18 years old, and I had never written him a poem. So the first thing I did was to write a poem that was a poem of apology to my father. And it was that experience that taught me how easy it is to overlook and to take for granted. Because my father was a giant in my life, and I never told him that. Not even in a poem after he had transitioned. So once that started, and if I could feel the healing potential in it, and that led me to go back. I had written things about Vinny when he had transitioned, and so I recouped those. And some of those poems I had not read them in over 10 years. So it was like going back to an old foundation and building a new house. That's what it felt like for me. But it was very therapeutic. Very therapeutic. Any other questions?
How do you stay inspired?
I just have to tell the truth. No one probably is affecting my insistence on getting things done creatively like Mike. Because more than anyone, he was my harshest critic. And at the same time, he was my biggest fan. So all those things, he's like, talk, get it done. Talk. And it's really interesting because I remember when I started coming back to myself after he transitioned. And I sat one day and said, now even though Mike is Mike and he transitioned, if Mike was here, what would he do? And I knew what he would do. He would grieve and then he'd get up and go to work. Because that was his nature. And so that very much inspires me, because he said the worst thing you can do is make shoulda, woulda, coulda your lifestyle. So that energizes me very much. I saw another. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, just, I was sort of curious when you were talking about Michael Jackson. I always had this impression that he was a very spiritual
He
person.
was.
Yeah.
He was.
And I wonder if you could talk about that, and also when you use the word transition, do you have thoughts about what that means? Like where are these?
Because for me, they're for me, even though I use the word death, for me the word that I feel is transition, because I think they're just in another form, and I think I call it the other side of the veil, and I believe because of that, we all fight to stay in this skin, in this vessel, but at the same time, I think this vessel is limiting, and we fight to stay in this vessel because we don't know what the other side means. There was something in his nature that, at least for me, gave me the sense that he had tapped into that a little bit and was not, even though he wanted to live forever on this side, I think at the same time, he understood transcendence and understand what I think I think it was anyone Jewish? I think it was a rabbi who said to me that death in his understanding. You know, there's this sense that it's a beyondness. You know, it's not that you're away, you're just beyond. And I think he you know, especially in his most creative moments, that I was privy to witnessing, he clearly transcended and was communicating on a level that was not everyday ordinary. He often said that a lot of the things that he wrote, that God dropped those things in his lap. You know, but my comment occasionally to him when he said that is, I said, but you put yourself in a place where you could communicate with God. Because he's not, those things aren't being dropped arbitrarily in your lap. So, and you only had, that could be he could be so quiet and so still for the longest amount of time. It was not human. And out of that would come just this wealth of sounds. You know, he didn't just get lyrics. He got lyrics, and then he could hear the layers of music that accompanied those words. You know, his voice was so incredible. He would sing the parts of the instruments and sound like those instruments. So, you know, there was clearly something unusual, and he himself acknowledged that it was something higher. You see, and in case you didn't know it, he always expressed the idea that his talent was given to him so that he could go out and heal the world. And that mission of responsibility, that this just isn't for me to live a certain comfortable life, is to have the kind of influence that can change the world. And I have seen no performer or politician who can bring together in one place the diversity of people that came to see him perform. And those performances were often like church services. I have videos to prove it. There was one, I think it was in Bucharest, Romania, where the people didn't want to leave. The people got on the PA system and said in several languages that he has left the arena, you need to go home. But they were caught up in waving candles in unison and singing "We Are the World," and they didn't want it to end. It was a religious experience for them. So you know something out of the ordinary. These weren't just ordinary concerts. Anyone? Yes, sir.
Yes, so with all that being said and the experience with Michael Jackson, I mean, how did you use those moments to really bring it into your art as an artist? Like, how did it influence you? Like, how did you take all of those magical things and just bring it out?
I'm not sure yet. I'm just not sure. You know, I just take my baby steps, and I will say I am writing a book about Michael, and it's not a commercial book. It's not a tell-all book. But it's my understanding of what was happening in his short films that we call videos. They weren't videos; they were short films. And a lot of what I consider to be his mission, I think are so for me, that's where I think I can take that inspiration and make a case for the fact that this was more than an entertainer, is by a kind of, I don't want to say, I'm not dissecting them really, I'm just bringing the bit of understanding that I have about them um, into a discussion that I think can be the beginning of looking at him and his work in a different way. The artwork for me is still very personal, and it's very protective. I won't tell any secrets in the artwork. So to a certain extent, it's not going to do what I think you're suggesting. I think I can approach that much better and I think writing critically about film is for me. I don't see this great line of demarcation between the visual and the audible. So maybe after that book I can do a little bit more of what you're suggesting. But right now I'm just taking baby steps. And it's still very painful to navigate through the Michael stuff. Not just because I miss him, but because of how he was treated. You know, I've still got some anger issues to deal with first. So, okay, let's get him to that. Yes.
All right. You mentioned that the boxes, buttons, and postcards are a metamorphosis. I have a question. What do the fans, is that part of it?
Yeah. And the fans are almost, I don't want to say signature icons for me, but they just embody so much. The fact that I'm Southern, the fact that I cherish the Black church, Southern Black church, the fact that some of my earliest memories were sitting on that pew, and you 2 and 3, it's hard to behave through those long Baptist church services. My dad's best friend was the pastor of the church that we attended, Wheat Street Baptist Church on Auburn Avenue, where the doors swing back on welcome hinges. And it's very hard to sit there and behave from 11 o'clock till like 1:45, And when you're 2, 3 years old. So one of the things, because my mother, who was so smart, my mother knew I had this thing for images, and the fans were fabulous. They'd have these beautiful, just these religious things, the little child praying and looking up in the light, and then you turn it over and it's, barbecue ads. I love that. And just that contradiction, I loved it. And my greatest fault as a young girl in church was I was always trying to get out of there with one of those fans. And you had to leave them on the edge of the last seat on the pew. You had to put the fans in. I was too small, but I was always trying to have one under the dress because I loved them. And just that's etched in my memory, and it's a very rich, warm, to this day I love fans. If anybody has fans, I'll take it. I just love them. But it carries all of that, but there's a whole sort of cultural, there are all kinds of cultural narratives just in the implications of that paper fan. And so they were some of the first button-based objects to surface, to come out of it. So I saw another hand. Yes, sir.
When you work with Michael on the ground, did you consider this a job or more of a relationship? How old was Michael when you first started
working with him? Now he would have something to say about working with him.
Well, that's what I'm saying.
Working for him? That's another way to put it. But my first encounter, he was 14. But it was years later that I was allowed to take some photographs. And that's what I'm saying. There's this yes, there's kind of an innocence and – I won't say he's gullible, but you know, he's gonna assume the best about everyone until they prove him wrong. That's why he made so many mistakes with people. But I always admired that about him. You know, I think it's healthier to start off at a positive. You know, if you're gonna make an assumption, make a positive assumption first. And that was the kind of person. But at the same time, you know, they called him the king. He was the king. It was a monarchy. You know, if he made a decision, that was it. And he might be open to discussion, and he's very polite, but at the end, he's like, okay, just do it the way I said, okay? You know, very much, despite what you might, very much a very shrewd businessman, but a visionary, way ahead of himself with a lot of things. I'm still hoping that somehow, some way, this opera, you know, I think it's an operatic symphony, something like that, that he very quietly was putting together. I hope that thing gets out. It has to be amazing. Let's see. Any other questions? Yes, ma'am.
I was really intrigued by your pairing of the visual and the poem. And you mentioned a minute ago that you really don't see a separation between the visual and the auditory. When you pair an object with a poem, do you consider them supplementing one another or really having a dialogue?
You know, personally, I think of them more as family. Because you know how a family is. It's, at least from my perception, you know, I don't care how much we clash or how mushy, you know, we get from time to time, whatever. At the end of the day, it's solid. And there's a point where it's like any other relationship. You know, to me, my thinking about a good marriage is there are moments when it's hard to tell where one stops and the other begins. And that's kind of how I think of the pairing of images. I'm showing you these because I wanted you to see what's on your walls and what's ultimately going to show up in the books, and how drastically different some of these images seem to be, but how similarly I see them. You know, it's like, for example, to talk about this particular image in Georgia O'Keeffe. What does this have to do with Georgia O'Keeffe, the sky? It's because there's something about her that's inseparable from Alfred Stieglitz, whether she wanted it to be seen as, you know, wanted to be realized as an individual. You almost can't bring her up without the mind going to Alfred Stieglitz, because there was this incredible love between the two of them. And I can't think of Stieglitz without thinking about equivalence. And so for me, I see these very strong ties between what might otherwise seem to someone else to be different images. So I could go from the O'Keeffe sort of quilted presentation to a photograph that I took from an airplane, and see them as sort of the same. And you know, she took walks every day up the mountain into the clouds. So there, you know, there's this, I don't see the big difference. I don't see a big difference between the kind of memorial state that is felt by so many of us for someone like Billie Holiday, and this photograph that I found sort of peeking out at me from a sea of drying roses. Someone had placed this memorial at the site of where their mother had collapsed and died. And in that in that spot of the ground, they went and made this memorial of their mother. And I said, well, this is not a cemetery. What are you doing? They said, this is where she fell, and this is where it ended. And so I marked this spot. And so it's you will find those pairings, those shifts. The Michael that you see in the show has been kind of replaced in the book with the stare of one of my ancestors. So, and that's how it's really funny because I believe that, I just believe in the fact that there's just a veil that you can. Is there anyone in here who can honestly say you have not had an experience where you thought you saw something, or you smelt a fragrance that was your aunt's fragrance, or they're not gone. You just don't have the eyes to see, and it's not a bad thing. It's just we're in a different dimension. But there are things that happen that remind us that that image of that image on your right, I think that's right, that was taken in Jerusalem. There are moments when I see certain sunsets, and that's one of my favorite things to do, watch the sun come up, watch it go down. But there are moments when I see sunsets, and it's like that image it's like it's almost like a projection in front of me. And I'm going back to Israel to find out exactly what occurred at that site, because that thing's haunting me. And who was that asked about the question mark? That's another question mark. I want to know what that is, because I don't know. But something in my soul knows. My soul has witnessed something. And I want to solve that mystery. The sent a letter to my love photo has been replaced by this sort of what I call this orchestra of trees. I love trees. So, any more questions? Any more questions? Okay, thank you.